Okay, in this video we're going to take a look at the view Mary Midgley calls moral isolationism. This is the view that she characterizes for the purpose of arguing against it. So let's take a look at trying out one's new sword. In paragraph 2, she says, "I shall call this position moral isolationism, and the point of the paper is to show that it's not forced upon us by reason, and indeed that it makes no sense at all." Before we get into any of the argument, let's just figure out what is this view, moral isolationism, that she has characterized and argued against. It's first introduced in the second half of the intro paragraph, but let's start at the beginning, where we are given a difficulty, a question, a puzzle, a problem, a challenge, a research question. All of us are more or less in trouble today about old-timey language for faced with the difficult task of trying to understand cultures strange to us. We hear constantly of alien customs. Like what? What are we talking about here? We read Prinz's paper, and he begins by pointing out that cultural beliefs and practices vary widely across time and place. For example, some cultures practice cannibalism, blood sports, killing for pleasure, public torture and execution, body modification, polygamy, arranged marriage, child brides. Okay, so we hear constantly of alien customs, especially as anthropology comes into its own and becomes part of our sort of popular understanding of the world. And we see changes in our lifetime which would have astonished our parents. So think about the sort of cultural social changes that have occurred over the last 10 to maybe 20 years. Changes in how we think about race and racism, how we think about sexuality, how we think about gender. These are the kinds of things that our parents, or imagine our grandparents and how they think about them, have changed over time. She continues, "I want to discuss here one very short way of dealing with this difficulty." Why is this a difficulty? What is the difficulty, the question, the problem, the challenge here? Without reading any further, I'm inclined to ask, well, how should we think about or respond to the fact that moral practices and beliefs vary so greatly across culture, time, and place? Just how should we think or respond to this? But that's pretty general and vague. Another question, or another way of putting what's essentially the same question, the first way is really from sort of an objective, sort of academic-y, I want to understand the world kind of worldview, but as individuals who hold beliefs and practice different things, and we encounter people who do things differently and believe differently, what's our response to that, right? So how should we respond when we encounter beliefs or practices that conflict with what we believe and practice? So again, before even reading on, I'm like, should we judge it? The way you do it is weird or not normal or bad or wrong? Or should we prevent it? The way you do it needs to stop, right? So there are different ways that we can imagine responding when we encounter people who do and think differently from us. But let's read the text. Okay, so I want to discuss here a way of dealing with this difficulty, this conflict of belief and action between different groups of people. It consists in simply denying that we can ever understand any culture except our own well enough to make judgments about it. So we're talking about judging. Those who recommend this hold that the world is sharply divided into separate societies, sealed units, each with its own system of thought. They feel that respect and tolerance due from one system to another forbids us from taking up a critical position, so we're talking about judgment, to any other culture. Moral judgment, they say, is a kind of coinage valid only in its country of origin. Okay, so it's clear we're talking about judging. Can we judge conflicting cultural practices? What does that mean? Here I'm thinking something like, can we say things like forcing slaves to fight to the death is morally bad or wrong? Or can we say, in abolishing slavery, society X, for example, ours, has made moral progress with respect to what's truly good and right? Emphasis on that, right? Is actually doing better, at least with this one, respect to this one thing. So can we do stuff like this? This is a question. Now, clarification. when we say, can we judge? We can't be taking this super literally, as in, can I be judging right now? I can definitely judge. I'm doing it now. I'm making an evaluative judgment about some kind of moral practice. You can't get into my head and control my thoughts and stop it. So yes, I can judge, but that's not what we're talking about, right? Can we judge well? Maybe that's the question here. So the question really seems to be about, can we judge and be right? Right? Can we make good, reasonable, warranted, objective judgments about the moral beliefs and practices of other cultures? Or not, for some reason. Okay, so let's copy and paste the first characterization we get of this view. And let's highlight what seems essential in it. So what is it? One way of responding to variation in moral practice or belief consists in simply denying that we can ever understand. So it's really focusing on the why can't we judge. So we're talking about making judgments, and the why not has to do with understanding. Those who recommend this hold that the world is sharply divided into separate societies. That seems to be an important part of the view as Midgley characterizes it. They feel that respect and tolerance, let's highlight that as a key term, due from one system to another, forbids us from taking up a critical position. So again, we are talking about judgments. Maybe it's worth highlighting all this emphasis on making judgments. So we can't take up a critical position to any other culture. Again, with the moral judgment, they suggest is a kind of coinage valid only in its country of origin. So again, we're talking about sort of separate societies, and you have to be a member of the society, perhaps, where only members of that society can make judgments. And the reasons why are essentially about understanding, respect, and tolerance. And there's something about the division of the world into separate societies. Okay, so if we've got this basic characterization from the intro, and we want to characterize moral isolationism as what? How do we characterize a view? We can characterize a view, like a general view, say the moral isolationist view or the moral relativist view, as a collection of beliefs or commitments, sometimes loose, or we can characterize it as a very specific single commitment, or perhaps as an argument. And in this case, I think we're sort of getting a bit of both. Mary Midgley is presenting this as sort of like the kind of view that she's encountered or is sort of putting together that people must hold given the kinds of things that they say. And it sounds like she has, say, anthropologists of a certain generation or specific ones in mind, or maybe people she's had conversations with. It's not necessarily the characterization of a very carefully constructed view that somebody has proposed in the literature that is the background conversation to this argument. It sounds instead just like the kinds of things that people who kind of believe this will tend to say, and does it fit together in a coherent picture? And she's arguing no, right? So we're getting sort of a possible loose collection of beliefs or commitments that this kind of person seems to hold. And there are claims supported by reasons here, and an argument is any claim supported by reason. So we're kind of characterizing it as both. So if what we've got here, this sort of collection of beliefs or commitments, is an argument, then what is the main claim? The main claim is something like, we can't make critical moral judgments about other cultures, but specifically, we can't make good, reasonable, warranted, objective, accurate, critical moral judgments about other cultures' moral beliefs, practices, codes. So something like this. And why? What reasons are we given? We don't understand them well enough, right? So it says that we can understand our own culture, but we don't understand any culture except our own well enough to make judgments. So there's something to do with understanding is the reason why. And there's also something about respect and tolerance. Where does the bit about us being in a world of sharply divided societies fit in? I'm not sort of listing these as independent things, just things that are definitely part of the collection of beliefs or commitments we're given when Midgley characterizes this view. And the claim is we can't make judgments. It has something to do with we don't understand other cultures well enough to do so, which seems to assume that we are separated and we can understand our own but not others. That sort of requires a commitment. So if I was going to put this somewhere, in part because divided societies bit, that's the isolationist part of the name and of this view, right? And then a claim about respect and tolerance is also connected as a reason why. So she uses, they feel that respect and tolerance forbids us. So that's the why we can't take up a critical position, judge another culture. So we've got sort of two main kinds of reasons. Now, this needs spelling out, right? Why exactly can't we make good critical judgments about other cultures? What exactly is the reason? What do we not understand? What do we need to understand? What does it take to respect another culture? Why would a critical judgment about another culture be an example of disrespect or intolerance? You know, there's a lot of room to spell out the move from we don't understand to we can't critically evaluate. And so one thing we might be on the lookout for as we read or reread Midgley's paper is what exactly is preventing us from making critical judgments. How do we spell out the argument from a lack of understanding to this claim? And likewise with respect and tolerance. And the other thing we might be on the lookout for is this the best characterization, right? Say you're sort of sympathetic to something like the moral isolationist view. Would you object to how Midgley is characterizing the argument about understanding? And does that leave a slightly different kind of moral isolationist view open as plausible if you were to just sort of reject something that she is sort of characterizing the moral isolationist as saying? So follow-up questions. What do we need to understand in order to make a good, true, accurate, reasonable, objective, whatever, judgment, like in general and about moral belief or practice in particular? So one thing that it seems we obviously need, and this appears to be the focus when we're talking about moral isolationism, is we need to understand the belief or practice in question. We need to understand this thing we are wanting to judge. And that's, again, the focus here. But follow-up questions to that. What specifically do we need in order to understand, sorry, I didn't phrase that well. What specifically do we need to understand in order to judge the belief or practice in question? So what do we need to understand about this belief or practice? And additionally, why do we need to be a member of the culture that holds the belief or engages in the practice in order to understand whatever it is that must be understood? Right, so can we get clearer on these questions? So another question I have is understanding of the belief or practice in question all we need? So recall my first follow-up question, what do we need in order to make a good judgment? And the focus, as Midgley presents moral isolationism, is that we need to understand this thing we are wanting to judge, the belief or practice. But in general, in order to make a good judgment, we need some sort of standard. If you want to say a thing is good, we have to hold it up against some kind of standard. So what do we need in order to judge a belief or practice? Maybe we need more than just understanding of the practice itself, but a standard to hold that practice to in order to call it good. And so one question that I'm left wondering here is, do I need to take a stand, on the possibility of there being objective standards against which we can judge various cultures across time and space. And later in the paper, Midgley does suggest that something like a commitment to there being no standards that we can use, she does sort of represent that as part of the moral isolationists' set of beliefs or commitments. Let's look at where. At paragraph 10, she says that moral isolationism would lay down a general ban on moral reasoning. Essentially, this is the program of a moralism, which I'm taking to be something like the view that there are no moral principles, or that we ought to resist all moral codes or all dominant moral codes. And she says that people who hold a view like this can no more afford to put moralizing out of business than smugglers can afford to abolish customs regulations. So maybe there is a commitment to something like there are no standards. You might think usually in order to judge something, you would need to have a standard for judging it, and there are no objective standards for judging the practices of other cultures, is part of this worldview that she's characterizing as moral isolationism. And then in the paragraphs that follow the bit we just looked at, paragraphs 12 and 13, this is where she imagines speaking with somebody who will hold this kind of view, like you can't judge the samurai because you don't understand them, and then will start explaining the things that would justify their behavior. This only makes sense if we, by our own lights, are identifying standards against which we can judge samurai culture and practices. And this person, in defending them, is suggesting we should judge them favorably against standards that make sense from our own perspective, right? So that this kind of thing that people who usually accept or would defend something like the moral isolationist view do really only makes sense if there are standards. So there are parts of the paper where she is talking about standards. Okay, so is understanding of the belief or practice in question all we need, or do we also need standards against which it is appropriate to judge beliefs and practices? And can we only judge the beliefs and practices of a given culture against its own standards, right? So as the moral isolationist, we kind of need to spell out why we can't make judgments, what it is we don't understand, what we would need to understand, why you need to be a member of a culture in order to have that understanding. And then the final question is about why exactly is critical judgment disrespectful and intolerant? So one question we should ask is, how does the moral isolationist answer these questions? Spell it out in more detail. The intro just introduces the view, but given Midgley's presentation of this view and the kinds of objections she raises and considers how they might respond, how does the moral isolationist answer these questions? And to answer this kind of question, we're talking about as characterized by Midgley. So what is this view she is characterizing and critiquing? It would be very useful to go beyond just summarizing that first intro paragraph section where she introduces it, but spelling out how they might answer these questions given how she has characterized them, right? And then the other question we could ask here is something like, how should or how could the moral isolationist, or one who is sympathetic to this kind of view, answer these questions? Where this is really asking you to sort of identify what seems essential to the view and how it might be tweaked in order to respond to the kinds of objections Midgley raises. So what's a more defensible characterization of the view if one is, the way Midgley has characterized it, is easily open to an objection? Okay, so I created an argument map that tries to capture the moral isolationist argument in a more complete way. Essentially, I'm trying to answer Q1 here. how does the moral isolationist answer these questions, and how does it fit together into a coherent view or argument? And I'm just looking at the way Midgley is characterizing the view to figure this out. And here's what I came up with. The main claim for the moral isolationist is that we cannot make good / reasonable, warranted, objective, true judgments about the practices of other cultures. Why think that? Co-premises. In order to make a good judgment about a cultural practice, we must be members of that culture, and we are members of one culture only, our own. So we can make judgments about our own, but not other cultures. Took that to be the core argument. And this is something she clearly attributes to the moral isolationist in the intro paragraph and at the end of the paper. What's the support for this, and where do we get this from the text? This seems to be attributed to the isolationist in paragraphs 1 and 4, that in order to judge, you must be a member of the culture. So why think that? Well, in order to make a good judgment, we need to understand the practice in question. Recall that was one of the things in my additional questions. What exactly do we need to understand about the belief or practice in question? We need some kind of rich understanding and appreciation of that practice. Maybe its history, maybe the sort of circumstances in which it's practiced, maybe the consequences of that practice for other people, maybe the sort of general factual beliefs that the culture holds are required in order to understand the practice. And especially, it seems like the underlying moral code or values are needed to understand the practice, right? So these kinds of things. Is that it? Have I captured it well enough? Is there more? Midgley doesn't, characterize this in any more detail, but what is it? What's plausible to say we would need to understand about a practice in order to really understand it? Is there something, even if I can say a lot about the history of the practice, the beliefs that people who engage in the practice hold, the underlying values or moral code they accept, the circumstances in which they're practicing it, the consequences for the community itself of engaging in this practice? If I understand all of that stuff, am I still missing something, or what? Why can't I get to understand that stuff? And if I can't, what am I missing, right? This is the question we're trying to answer here. Whatever it is, in order to make a good judgment, we need to know stuff about that practice, the important stuff, and presumably the underlying moral code or values. And we can't understand and appreciate the practices of other cultures in the way or to the extent that is necessary to form a good judgment, whatever that is. So this kind of claim she seems to attribute to the moral isolationist throughout the paper, and I take it that she is presenting this as one of the fundamental sort of premises in the moral isolationist argument. And I've kind of highlighted in yellow the things that are especially fundamental premises that are not themselves, supported by other things. So why think that in order to make a good judgment, we need to understand the practice itself? Well, here are some reasons. Forget this note for now. Let's just look at reasons that would support this, that just sort of makes sense, and see if we find these in Midgley's characterization of moral isolationism. Well, 1, in order to make a good judgment about any action or practice, we need to apply an appropriate standard of good or right, and commitment. There are no objective standards. The only standard appropriate for judging a cultural practice is the moral code or standard of good or right accepted by that culture. Okay, so here's where I sort of gone out on a bit of an interpretive limb. As I suggested before, is understanding the practice all we need? Do we also need standards against which to judge it? And can we only judge beliefs against the culture's own standard? And I suggested that Midgley is characterizing the moral isolationist as saying yes, or at least when she considers the person who would argue about the samurai case, she's saying they don't really, if you think about it, believe this, but they say that. And that's kind of her strategy for objecting to moral isolationism all along. So like, here's a collection of beliefs that people think sound right or plausible, but they actually conflict with other things they believe. They don't really believe these things, and if you spell out their implications, they wouldn't accept it. That's her sort of strategy, is you think you're a moral isolationist, you think that you can't understand other cultures or that they can only be judged against their own moral code, but you're wrong. So I characterized this as part of moral isolationism, the claim that there are no objective standards, we should reject any dominant moral code. The only standard for which it is appropriate to judge a cultural practice is that culture's own standard. So this is the sort of bigger claim where now the moral isolationist view sounds like moral relativism, as we see in Prinz's paper. But this wasn't stressed so clearly as part of the view as the part about understanding. But again, what is it we need to understand? And if it's the underlying moral code or values, what is the significance of that? Why do we need to understand them so well? And there does seem to be this assumption that she is characterizing them as holding, that those are the only standards appropriate for judging them. Maybe. This is where, again, there's room for sort of interpretive work here that's interesting and good to do. So that's my characterization of the moral isolationists' reasoning as presented by Midgley throughout the text. And recall when I gave you my Midgley map template to work with, I suggested that there were two main strategies for mapping her argument. Because she is primarily or exclusively arguing against this view, it would make sense to lay out the view and then figure out where everything that she says goes as an objection. The other option for mapping Midgley's argument was to make the main claim just that we should reject moral isolationism and give her arguments for it. And the major argumentative structure seems to be that the commitments of moral isolationism conflict with what we generally believe, including the would-be moral isolationist, right? So there are counterintuitive implications that the people she's characterizing seem themselves not to really accept. And so a practice that Prinz even says we can do if we're relativists is figure out if our beliefs fit together, right? If they're consistent. Maybe one of the things that we can want in our belief system is that it's at least consistent. And so Midgley might be arguing that the would-be moral isolationist who hasn't thought about it in much detail probably holds some inconsistent beliefs. So there were two ways to map it. I've already shared my overarching structure of Midgley's map, and this is how I mapped the moral isolationist view constructed as an argument, which I've distilled from the Midgley text. We could now fit Midgley's objections into this, and perhaps we can more easily compare and contrast it with the view moral relativism that we get from Prinz. And again, this part down here is where it starts to get more like the view we get from Prinz, but that wasn't emphasized as clearly as just the point about understanding in Midgley's presentation of moral isolationism. So one question is moral isolationism essentially moral relativism? How is Prinz's characterization and argument for moral relativism similar or different from this kind of view? The conclusion and the progression of reasons for this conclusion, how does it compare and contrast? Okay, that ends my presentation of moral isolationism.